In the spring of 1221, a desperate prince named Jalaluddin stood in the mountain passes of Afghanistan. He made a decision that should have resulted in his annihilation. Behind him lay the smoking ruins of the Khwarazmian Empire, once the wealthiest civilization in Central Asia, now reduced to mass graves and pyramids of skulls by Genghis Khan's armies. Every major city, from Samarkand to Bukhara, had been systematically erased. Their populations slaughtered down to the last child. Jalaluddin's father, the Shah, had fled like a coward, abandoning his people to massacre and ruin. He died alone on a desolate island in the Caspian Sea, a broken ruler who had run from city to city in absolute terror. The Mongol invasion had begun with a single catastrophic mistake. When Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan to the Khwarazmian Empire, the governor of Otrar accused the merchants of spying and executed them all. Genghis Khan demanded justice, but the Shah, drunk on arrogance and fear, responded by killing the Mongol ambassadors as well. It was a decision that sealed the fate of his empire, because Genghis Khan's response was not diplomacy, it was annihilation. Every major city that had once stood proudly under the Khwarazmian banner now lay in ruins. The Mongols had swept through them with a fury that defied imagination, leaving behind smoking streets, shattered walls, and the silence of a people who no longer remained. Entire populations were wiped out, their cities reduced to ash, their names remembered only as warnings. In the aftermath of the Mongol devastation, when cities lay silent and the empire had collapsed into dust, Jalal-ad-Din stood alone among the ruins of a world that no longer existed. The Khwarazmian Empire had been one of the great powers of its age. Its cities were centers of learning, trade, and culture. But now the streets of Samarkand were empty, the mosques of Bukhara burned, and the proud walls of Nishapur had been reduced to ash. Jalal ad-Din could have fled, as so many others had. He could have vanished into the mountains or sought refuge in distant lands. But instead, he chose the path of resistance. He began by gathering the scattered remnants of his people. Survivors emerged from the ruins of burned villages, carrying whatever they could salvage. Warriors who had lost their families, their homes, and their purpose now found a new one under his banner. Refugees followed him through mountain passes, across barren plains, and through the shattered remains of once great cities. They came not because he promised victory, but because he refused to surrender. Slowly, painfully, a new force began to form. It was not an imperial army. It had no supply lines, no treasury, no grand strategy. What it had was something far more dangerous. Men with nothing left to lose. Around campfires, they spoke of the horrors they had witnessed. Entire families wiped out, cities erased, lands swallowed by fire. And in those stories, a shared resolve began to grow. Jalal ad-Din trained them relentlessly. He taught them discipline, unity, and the will to stand firm against the Mongol tide. Day by day, their numbers grew. 30,000 men gathered under his command, a force forged not by empire, but by survival. And as the Mongols swept across the land, believing all resistance had been crushed, they did not yet know that a storm was rising in the west. Jalal ad-Din had rebuilt an army, and soon he would face the Mongols in open battle. With his army rebuilt from the ashes of a fallen empire, Jalal ad-Din did not wait for the Mongols to descend upon him. He marched north, toward the mountains, toward the narrow valleys where he believed he could finally challenge the unstoppable tide that had consumed his world. Behind him, the land still burned. Villages reduced to charcoal, fields trampled into dust. The bones of the fallen scattered across roads that once carried caravans and scholars. Every ruined settlement was a reminder of what the Mongols had taken and what little remained to defend. But ahead of him lay the Parwan Valley, a place where the mountains closed in, where the land tightened into a natural funnel, where cavalry could not maneuver freely. Jalal ad-Din understood the Mongols better than most commanders alive. He knew their strength was speed. He knew their arrows were deadliest in open plains. And he knew that if he fought them on their terms, he would be swept aside like every army before him. So he chose a battlefield where their horses would be slowed, where their formations would be forced to compress, and where his shield wall could hold firm. As his men marched, they passed the ruins of their own world. Charred beams, collapsed mosques, abandoned armor, the remnants of families who had fled or fallen. Every step hardened their resolve. Every ruin reminded them that there was no home to return to unless they fought for it. At night, the campfires flickered across the valley floor. Veterans spoke of the fall of Samarkand, of walls breached, of defenders overwhelmed, of streets filled with smoke. Refugees whispered the names of loved ones who had vanished in the chaos. Young warriors, many of whom had never faced the Mongols before, stared into the flames, knowing that dawn would bring the greatest test of their lives. Meanwhile, far to the east, the Mongols were closing in. A detachment under Shigi Kutuk, one of Genghis Khan's most trusted commanders, had been sent to crush Jalal ad-Din before his army grew any larger. Kutuk was a veteran of countless campaigns, a man who had seen cities fall and kingdoms crumble. He had no intention of allowing a Khwarazmian prince to rise from the ashes. The Mongols followed the trails of refugees, the smoke rising from burned villages, and the hoofprints left in the dust. Every sign pointed to one truth. Jalal ad-Din was not running, he was preparing. As the Mongols advanced, Jalal ad-Din's scouts watched from the ridges. They saw the dust clouds on the horizon. They heard the distant thunder of hooves. They counted the banners, fewer than expected, but still deadly. This was not the full might of the Mongol Empire, but it was a force capable of annihilating kingdoms. Jalal ad-Din reached Parwan first. He surveyed the valley, the narrow throat of land, the steep ridges, the rocky slopes. This was where he would make his stand. This was where he would challenge the myth of Mongol invincibility. He ordered his men to prepare defensive positions. The shield wall would hold the center. Foot archers would stand behind them, ready to unleash volleys of their own. His cavalry, the few he had left, would wait on the flanks, hidden by the terrain, ready to strike when the Mongols overcommitted. It was a formation no Mongol commander had ever faced, a formation designed not to chase, not to retreat, but to absorb the Mongol assault and break it. At dawn, the Mongol vanguard finally appeared at the mouth of the Parwan Valley. Their banners rose through the dust, followed by disciplined ranks of horsemen moving with cold precision. Jalal ad-Din's men watched in silence, gripping their shields, waiting for the storm they had feared for years. Shigi Kutuk rode to the front of his formation. He studied the narrow valley, the steep ridges, and the shield wall Jalal ad-Din had built across the throat of the land. This was not the open plain the Mongols preferred, but Kutuk was confident. He had crushed armies far larger than this. He raised his arm. The Mongol archers moved forward. A moment of stillness passed across the valley, and then the first volley rose into the sky. A black cloud of arrows arced overhead and crashed down onto the Khwarazmian line. Shields shook, wood splintered, men staggered, but the formation held. Jalal ad-Din gave the order to return fire. His foot archers stepped forward and unleashed a low, deadly volley that struck the Mongol front ranks. Horses reared. A few riders fell. For the first time, the Mongols felt resistance. Kutuk ordered a second volley, then a third. The valley filled with the hiss of arrows and the thud of impacts. Still, the shield wall did not break. Frustrated, Kutuku signaled his wings to spread and envelop the Khwarazmian flanks, a maneuver that had shattered countless armies. But the valley worked against him. The ridges narrowed his approach, slowing his cavalry and forcing them into tighter formations. Jalal ad-Din saw the movement. His hidden cavalry on the slopes tightened their grips on their reins, waiting for the moment to strike. The first phase of the Battle of Parwan had begun, and for the first time in years, the Mongols were not advancing with ease. They were being challenged. The Mongol wings continued to push outward, trying to wrap around the Khwarazmian line, It was a maneuver that had crushed armies from China to Persia, a sweeping motion that closed like a jaw around its prey. But in Parwan, the valley betrayed them. The ridges narrowed their advance. Their horses struggled for space. Their formations compressed instead of expanding. And for the first time, the Mongols felt the terrain working against them. Jalal ad-Din saw the hesitation. He rode along his line, shouting for his men to hold steady. The shield wall tightened. The archers adjusted their aim. Every man understood that this was the moment the Mongols usually broke their enemies. But today, the roles were beginning to reverse. Kutuk ordered his front ranks to press harder. Mongol riders surged forward, loosing arrows at close range. Some Khwarazmian shields cracked. A few men fell, but the line did not collapse. Then Jalal ad-Din gave the signal. From the slopes on both sides of the valley, his hidden cavalry charged. Not a massive force, just a few hundred riders, but enough to strike the Mongol flanks at the exact moment they were stretched thin. The impact was immediate. Mongol riders turned in surprise. Their horses stumbled on the uneven ground. Their tight formations made it difficult to maneuver. For the first time in years, Mongol cavalry were reacting instead of dictating the fight. Jalal ad-Din's men pressed forward. The shield wall advanced step by step, pushing the Mongols back toward the narrowest part of the valley. Arrows flew at point-blank range. Swords clashed. The air filled with dust and shouts and the thunder of hooves. Kutuk tried to rally his men, but the valley was working against him. His wings could not spread. His center could not break the shield wall, and his riders were being harassed from the slopes. The Mongols were still deadly, still disciplined, but they were losing momentum. For the first time in the entire Khwarazmian War, the Mongols were being pushed backward, and Jalal ad-Din knew it. He rode to the front, raised his sword, and shouted for his men to press harder. The valley echoed with the roar of warriors who had lost everything, and were now fighting not just to survive, but to win. The Battle of Parwan was entering its decisive phase. Genghis Khan wasted no time. The moment he heard of Jalal ad-Din's victory, he ordered a full army to assemble. Not a detachment, not a scouting force, but a massive host led by the great Khan himself. If Jalal ad-Din wanted to challenge Mongol supremacy, then Genghis Khan would answer him personally. Jalal ad-Din soon learned the truth. Scouts returned with reports of an enormous Mongol force moving west, burning every settlement that had offered him shelter. Villages that had celebrated his victory were now in flames. Anyone who had aided him was punished without mercy. Jalal ad-Din understood the message. This was no longer a campaign. This was a hunt. He ordered his army to move south, away from Parwan, toward the rugged mountains and deep valleys that might slow the Mongol advance. But the march was brutal. His men were exhausted from the battle. Supplies were scarce. Refugees followed the army in long, desperate lines, slowing the pace even further. And behind them, the Mongols closed in. Day after day, Jalal ad-Din's scouts reported the same thing. The dust cloud on the horizon was growing. The thunder of hooves was getting louder. The great Khan was gaining ground. Jalal ad-Din pushed his men harder. They crossed narrow ridges where a single misstep meant death. They marched through forests where the branches tore at their armor. They descended into valleys where the heat suffocated them. But still they moved, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant annihilation. At night, the fires were kept low. Men whispered in fear, knowing the Mongols were somewhere in the darkness behind them. Some claimed they could hear distant horns. Others swore they saw riders on the ridgelines. Jalal ad-Din remained calm. He rode among his men, encouraging them, reminding them that they had already done the impossible once. But even he knew the truth. They could not outrun the Mongols forever. Finally, after days of relentless marching, the land opened before them. A vast river, wide, deep, and raging with spring currents, blocked their path. The Indus. Behind them, the Mongol vanguard appeared on the hills. Ahead of them, the river roared like a living beast. Jalal ad-Din had reached the edge of the world. There was nowhere left to run. The great Khan was moments away, and the only path to survival lay across the furious waters of the Indus River. The stage was set for one of the most legendary escapes in medieval history. Jalal ad-Din stood at the edge of the Indus River, staring at the raging water below. The river was swollen with spring currents, crashing against the rocks with a force that could tear a man apart. Behind him, his exhausted army gathered in silence, knowing the Mongols were only moments away. Then the horns sounded. From the ridges above, the Mongol vanguard appeared, dark silhouettes against the sky, spreading across the high ground like a tightening noose. Dust rolled down the slopes as more riders arrived, forming a wall of steel and horseflesh that blocked any hope of retreat. Genghis Khan himself rode to the front. He looked down at Jalal ad-Din, the last surviving heir of the Khwarazmian Empire, the man who had dared to defeat his army at Parwan. For a long moment, neither commander moved. The river roared between them. The wind carried the smell of dust and sweat and fear. Jalal ad-Din knew he had only two choices: surrender and die or attempt the impossible. He turned to his men, the survivors who had followed him through fire, mountains, and endless pursuit. Many were wounded. Many could barely stand. But all of them looked to him for a decision. He made it. Jalal ad-Din spurred his horse forward, galloping toward the cliff's edge. His commanders shouted in shock. Mongol archers raised their bows. Genghis Khan leaned forward in his saddle, watching intently. Without hesitation, Jalal ad-Din drove his horse off the cliff. For a heartbeat, horse and rider hung in the air, a silhouette against the sky. Then they plunged into the raging river below, swallowed by the white water and the roar of the Indus. The Mongols stared in disbelief. No one had ever attempted such a leap. No one had ever escaped the great Khan in such a way. Even Genghis Khan himself was struck by the audacity of the act. He lowered his bow and spoke quietly to the men beside him. A son should be like that. Below, Jalal ad-Din surfaced, clinging to his horse as the current dragged them downstream. His remaining warriors followed, leaping into the river one by one, choosing the fury of the Indus over the certainty of Mongol execution. The river carried them away, battered, scattered, but alive. Jalal ad-Din had escaped the greatest conqueror in history, and in doing so he carved his name into legend.